This Quoircast podcast is brought to you by The Joy of Letting Go by Kevin Sweeney. When one of the great living mystics, Richard Rohr, writes, all great spirituality is somehow about letting go. Do we just skim by it and look for the next great quote? Or do we allow this truth to utterly change our relationship with God, humanity, and reality itself? And if we accept letting go as the key to transformation, the question becomes how? How is each life-altering step of the spiritual journey somehow about letting go? Well, my new book, The Joy of Letting Go, is the answer to that question. My dream is that everyone who reads this will open up to the possibility that to engage everything from the concrete to the cosmic, and from the tiniest arguments with your partner to the biggest social tragedies of our time, without losing our joy, we have to learn how to let go.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Welcome back to the podcast, the one that we have called This Is Not Church, because if it was church, you would have left by now. So we're glad that you guys are all with us, that you've continued. This is our first interview of 2023. So ding, 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 ding. Welcome into the new year, man. I'm excited. Yeah. And this is a gentleman that we have on today that we have actually tried to get a hold of in the past, and we finally had a chance to make it work. He's coming to us all the way from Australia. We have with us today Gary Grant, author of numerous books. The one that we're going to talk about that he calls more of a discussion starter than a book is called Building Church as a Family. Let me read you a short bio, and then we're just going to jump straight into the conversation. So it says he was born in Harare, Zimbabwe, educated in South Africa. It was at the age of 17 in the midst of revival movement in the 1980s that Gary encountered God. As a result, the miraculous power of God has been a constant throughout his adult life, shaping Gary into who he is today. In 1994, Gary, along with his family, immigrated to Australia with a passion to establish strong communities of faith. Gary, alongside with his wife, Debbie, are currently the senior leaders of the Friends First community in Melbourne. They have traveled extensively preaching the gospel of the kingdom message in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Sri Lanka, South Korea, and India. They have 2 grown children, Joel married to Lana and David married to Dahna, and now not just one, but how many grands? 3 total?
3, yeah.
3. You said you had 2 more, so I can do math. Look at that. 1. we were discussing before we hit the record button. Sometimes we have to double check the bios and make sure that they're still accurate. So he's like, no, we've got 2 more grandies, as he called them, to add to the mix. So there's 3, and that's amazing. So that's it. But I'm sure it doesn't come near to encapsulating everything about this gentleman. I do know that looking at the back of his book, he's got Paul Young wrote something very nice about it, which I think is great. We love Paul. He's one of our favorite people who's been on the show numerous times. So if you can get an endorsement from William Paul Young, man, I think you're probably doing something right. So welcome to the podcast, brother.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Good to be with you.
Well, it's good to have you here. If you don't mind, normally our first sort of routine question that we ask people is just to kind of give us a rundown, a Cliff Notes version of your faith journey. And for some, that's longer than others, but I'm sure we can synopsize it. Is that a word, John? Synopsize?
Is now.
Anyway. Okay. If it isn't, I made it. If it is, then good for me, I guess. But anyway, would you mind kind of giving us that rundown? That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I was born in Harare, Zimbabwe, immigrated to South Africa as a youngster, and at the age of 17, did one of those altar call, as you're probably aware of, back in those days, as Paul would say, my people. And it was a revival. I mean, when I say revival, I'm talking about, everyone has a different concept of what revival is. For me, experiencing God in a tangible way, I guess, rather than just hearing about him or knowing about him, but encountering him. And so there was 9 years of incredible miracles, not just people bluffing stuff, but limbs growing out. I mean, I saw fingers appearing where there were none, eyeballs appearing where there were none before, stuff like that. So amazing miracles and just huge times of amazing, experiencing the tangible presence of God. So that was kind of my, baptism into Christendom. Didn't grow up in a Christian family necessarily, but we believed in God, but never really practiced much Christianity, I guess. And I got swept up into that. I am now I've planted 2 communities in Australia, immigrated here in 1994. One in Sydney, which is still going, and then this one here. But there's been a bit of a journey or change in my life as time's gone on. So I guess you could say I've probably left the Jesus I came to know in some way, and rediscovering a different Jesus. And that would not be fair to say that was how I started, because in the revival days, I'm pretty much going back to encountering what I had then now. So, but in any time, guys, I'm just waffling. It is early in the morning here, but
that is true. We forget about the time difference. Also, the one thing you brought up before was we forget about the season differences. So John's up in Northern California. He woke up this morning to snow, and you're in holiday mode in the southern hemisphere. So
it's 32 degrees Celsius here. So what's that? I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit.
I said I did math, but basic arithmetic. So I'm gonna guess that's probably 80 or 90.
90, yeah, around there.
Yeah, I don't know. I could look it up, but that would take effort, and I'm not sure. But regardless, you're in Australia, and so the times are way off, the season's way off, and so Australians in general are pretty off, which we enjoy. I think that's amazing. John and I had a discussion about another podcast that joined our network recently, and I have confirmed that they are Australian, John.
Okay, all right.
But there was a fairly long and running joke about were they Aussies or Kiwis, and was there really a difference?
Yeah.
And I was just like, I'm sure that is going to piss somebody off, man. So of course, there's a difference.
Definitely a difference.
We don't know what that is though, because we're Americans, and therefore that means we're tunnel visioned, and all we know is America.
Yeah, well, I mean, for an Aussie, they would definitely say I've got a South African accent. But I was in the States in June last year, and someone said, "I love your Aussie accent." So.
And you're like, wait a minute.
And I'm like, yeah, it's a great accent. Keep speaking. It's fantastic. I love the accent.
Yeah. That is a benefit for anyone from Australia, the UK, any place. Americans are just enamored of accents. We just love it, man. You can say, we had Douglas Campbell on last year, and maybe the year before. Anyway, and he's from New Zealand. And, I can listen to that guy talk all day. I'd like to get Peter Rollins on someday, but I'm not sure I can understand a word that guy says. His Irish brogue is thick.
Yeah.
I mean, it's melodic and beautiful, but half the time I'm like, what the hell did you just say? I don't know. Anyway, but we digress. As by the way, you should be warned. That's kind of our tagline. We digress.
That's fine.
So let's talk about church, because John and I are both, we're church folks. We're born and raised in church. John left for a good chunk of time. I stayed around and tried my damnedest, I guess, if that's not too a heretical thing to say. I tried my damnedest to push for some change from inside of the institution. But we both have our, I don't know, how would you, I mean, I have a complicated relationship, let's just say that, with church.
I think that, church, ecclesia or ecclesia, I think, I guess if you're in the West, you think of that business thing, the smoke machines and the 3 fast longs and 3 slow ones,
Right.
That kind of deal on the tea and coffee afterwards if you're doing that. I think that one of the things for me was in Acts 1 verse 8, as Jesus says, he says, you'll receive power from on high. And it used to be in our kind of our charismatic church would be the dunamis thing of the power of the Holy Ghost. But another translation could be you'll receive the ability to build dynasty or dynastia, which is a very different take. And so I'll build my ecclesia, my people, my nation, and the gates of Hades will not invade. Kind of, if you think about that in the context of the modern day or the Western concept of church, we probably lose most of it. But if you think of it in the case of a family, a heritage, or I guess a culture that's been lost. So I work a lot into India. I've been there 30 odd times, and so the cultural clash between a South African Aussie going into an Indian context. There's a lot of differences in the culture. And I guess what Jesus was saying, in my understanding, is that he's going to bring the culture of the kingdom into the earth. It's like we've never really been disconnected from God. We just have seen him, or God's been an enemy in our own eyes. In other words, there's such a cultural shift away from what is kingdom and how God operates that Jesus came to restore that. And so then that kind of takes on this different, I guess, push when it comes to the understanding of ecclesia. Or there's a lot of words that we use in the English that probably we don't like. But the truth is that Jesus is building a nation or a people group that understand the culture of the kingdom and are able to usher in the kingdom. And so this is a transformation of the way, it's actually a complete working on our inner world. And so for me, Jesus' first message, Isaiah 61, which was, I've come to bind the brokenhearted, set the captives free, was very intentional. And it's really, I've come to transform your culture. I've come to get you to disagree with the things that you're agreeing with and agree with me, I guess, or see things the way I see them. And so if that becomes the go-to point as being the focus of a transformation in our culture, then the question really is, what spaces do we create? Do we intentionally create to allow that process? Or what spaces do we focus on? And I call them parented spaces that people can congregate in to allow that change to happen. And I don't know that putting people into a big building and having a monologue is going to really do that. I think people in a smaller context where there's lots of dialogue is far more fruitful in that process. And so I think we've lost, because we've got the business of church in the way and money in the way, we've kind of lost our way a bit, I think, in the West, certainly.
Well, and you bring up the issue of kingdom, and my issue with the church, in quotes, especially from an American perspective, and I think actually in Australia, you see enough of this as well, is that there's more interest in empires than there is in a kingdom. And so the dynasty that someone like, say, a Hillsong is interested in is one that I think is antithetical to the kingdom, because theirs is more about accumulation, and it's about how much bigger can my little piece of the pie be. And I think there's some good intentions buried down there, but I think we've all seen what the fruit of that eventually is, right? Is that you end up with structures that dehumanize, all under the guise of preaching a gospel that is somewhat exclusive, that leaves people out. But and then you find out that there's all kinds of pretty scary stuff that's been swept under the carpet for decades. In some cases, the father of Joel Houston, of Brian Houston. I'm sorry, Brian Houston's father's. The documentary on Hillsong is tragic to see. But that to me is a symptom or a result of getting your eyes off of a kingdom mindset and getting it onto an imperial mindset.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, look, the thing is that there's obviously lots of God works in whatever circumstance you give him, and so we can focus on Frank's thing and Brian's thing. I've met them, and I've met Frank as well, but back in the day, I mean, he's been long gone now. So that's Brian's father. But I think the thing that I'm addressing, I guess, is not trying to talk against the establishments, whatever they are. I just think the methodology needs a bit of a renovation, So the methodology being the way we do church. I mean, the outcome is to be able to raise a child in the way you should go. So it's like you raising a youngster, and you're able to get them to know and hear the voice of God, and for that to take place with all their uniqueness and their personality and so on, you can't put them through some cookie cutter kind of religious process. They need to be in a family, and when I say family, I'm not necessarily talking mum and dad and kids. I'm talking a community group that function in love, for the sole purpose of seeing the culture of their hearts formed in a kingdom way. And so So when we look at the church being, certainly in the West, or I mean, as you said, in the States and here in Australia, I think it's the business of church. It's the I've been involved in small and big and mega church most of my life, and I think that, I wouldn't choose to be involved in mega church now. Certainly, I wouldn't speak against it necessarily. I just don't think that it's fruitful. I think it's far more fruitful being more connected with people. And so, peddling the gospel in a contractual versus a covenantal way, I guess that's probably my go-to.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I've spent most of my life in medium-sized churches. And that's all very, what's the word? It's all subjective, or does that make sense? That's not what I'm thinking of, but it's relative. Thank you, brain, for finally kicking in with that word. Yeah. It's relative, right? If you're in a city of 100,000 people and your church gets 1,000 people in there a week, I call you a mega church. I mean, you've got a chunk of the population come to church. We can't all be Joel Osteen and have 40,000 people in church. But my misgivings about that always were, number one, the business side of it, because the bigger a structure gets, the more resources it requires to maintain itself. It seems like the more and more of those resources are just kept to them. They have to be kept inside to maintain the health of that organization. And then I just didn't see, you spoke of transformation. I didn't see much of that. I saw an emphasis on conversion. I saw an emphasis on giving people an experience where they might, as we would say in staff meetings, as we were strategizing, we need to move people towards a decision. We would do that with the 3 songs, like you mentioned it, right? So we had a worship service that was structured in a way that was borderline manipulative, in order to get people to a place where they'd make a decision, and then we could cross them. We could add check marks to our ledgers. But I didn't see much beyond that. Does that make sense? I mean, I didn't see an emphasis on what does this do for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you think about it. Okay, so you're an individual that has got a culture that's non-kingdom, and so Jesus steps into your world, whether it's 2,000 years ago, as in the context of him walking around Galilee, or whether it's in your life now here in Northern California. He steps into your world, and what's he trying to do? You're always connected to him, by the way. You just don't know it. And so what he's trying to do is get you to step away from the culture that you think it is, or life what you think it is, and step into what the way you designed, to come into the fullness. So we created that sinner's prayer, which has only been around for 100 odd years. And then what? And then what? Do we all clap and say you're going to heaven and not going to hell, and now that's it? Or what is it really about? So it made no sense to me. That's been the transformation. So when I think of my early days as revival, I'm thinking about just the rawness of Holy Spirit just touching lives. And it pulled down the apartheid system in South Africa, that move. I think that was God's intention. And it really is about a transformation of your inner world. And so if it's about transformation of your inner world, then what structure do you want to step inside to transform your inner world? And what I'm suggesting is the methodology of mega church doesn't address your inner world. It's difficult because you've got a guy or a girl with a microphone, and you listening, and then you're going home after a hug and a coffee, and so where's your question being answered, and where can you dialogue while you do that in your, what I mean? So I think that's been, as I was journeying towards, I remember sitting in Cambodia years ago with a friend who leads a mega church, and he said to me, "I agree with you, Gary, but there's no money in it." And I said, "Well, thanks for being honest, because I think that's really it. Is that there's no money, and that's why we don't do it,
But think about this, though, because while you're talking, these are the images that are kind of popping through my head. And John, I know I'm going to turn this over to you in a second, so I apologize for dominating, but these things keep popping in my head. I think of an organization like Alcoholics Anonymous, And I wonder what would happen to number one, what would happen to an organization like that if it ever became corporatized? What would that look like? But because as you're talking, as we're discussing this process of transformation, I think about the 12 steps. And I think about the fact that for an alcoholic going through something like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or whatever, those steps never end. They don't get to the end of that and go, woo, all right, I'm no longer this. They sometimes you hear them talk about going back to the steps. They have structures built inside of that organization that help them have relationships, which help them be accountable to somebody. They regularly meet together, but there is something different about the approach that says, listen, this is not a one and done. Otherwise you could have people dragged into a church basement somewhere, have them give their sinner's prayer of addiction, and then be like, well, you're good to go, man. You may still kill yourself with heroin tomorrow, but at least you're going to heaven. So we're good to go there, right?
So in dismantling this, remember, if you reject the whole church system, then you kind of leave. So that's what I haven't done. I haven't rejected the whole church system. I'm trying to get people to come on the journey with me. And so I guess if I could introduce another thought. So there's transformational. Another thought for me is, if we make it about hell and heaven, then we've got a contractual arrangement with God. And let me explain that. You got no option, right? If I preach that when you die, you're going to hell or heaven, what's your options? You obviously want to go to heaven. So what do you have to do to keep your get into heaven card? And so to keep your get into heaven card, you need to go to all these meetings or whatever else you need to do, pay your tithes or whatever you've been told. But it's still a contractual arrangement. So then how do you have a relationship with God in a covenantal way when you've entered into that relationship contractually? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And it's manipulative as all hell.
Yeah, it is manipulative, but it's worse than that, because now you have to mask up and pretend that you're somebody that you're not.
Right, absolutely.
Because the only way you're going to be able to keep your end of the deal is to be this fake whatever you think you should be. And you can't be yourself. So what happens if you start to build covenantally? Well, now, what happens I always say to people, look, take the heaven and hell story away. I mean, I've got my thoughts about heaven and hell, but let's just take it all away. Never talk about it ever. And let's talk about a reconciliation with the Father God. Let's talk about a love relationship. Let's talk about a covenantal connection. That's a journey where He honors your free choice continually, and you're journeying into this beautiful, deeper connection with God. Now suddenly you've got a different perspective, because you're really discovering that you can never get to the end of discovering who He is. It never ends, right? And so now you go, okay, so where do I need to, if you wanted to travel to Australia from where you guys are, you'd have to hop on an airplane. You could get on a boat and row. It'd take you a while. But if you hopped on an aircraft, it'd be a lot quicker. So to do this journey of covenant, what vehicle do you need to jump inside? That's what I'm trying to say. And I think that you need to gather somehow. But it's how you gather that's important. And if you took the business of church away, so it's not about the money, it's actually about the end goal, which is to know Him, and for yourself to be known. I mean, to have intimacy, you need to be known. To feel loved, all of you needs to be known. You can't have hiddenness. And in fact, the gospel says that we to walk in the light. So walking in light is difficult because it exposes all kinds of things. And I think that's what community should be. I actually think that's what the Holy Spirit's doing right now across the planet.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, there's definitely, I would call it a seismic shift, 100%, there's something subterranean and deep going on, and whatever term you want to use it, the term du jour, you can call it deconstruction if you want to. I've written about it. John has too. And it doesn't matter to me what you call it. What does matter is that it feels like the old systems are being shaken.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of, there's that verse, is all they can shake will shake, all they can, So, and that's fine with me. I'm actually on the side going, shake it. Let's see what survives. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if it's worth a damn, then my questioning and my doubt and my I couldn't possibly shake it, right? If the gates of hell can't prevail against the church, against the ecclesia, whatever that is or what it looks like, then it should not tremble and be afraid or get defensive about the questions that people have about it. It should stand firm and say, listen, you can throw whatever you want to at us, but we have this assurance, right?
Well, I'll tell you what we did. So 5 years ago, we opened up a little school. We called it an academy, and it's not, people have all these different terms, but for us, it was a rabbinical way of learning. So we'd never have more than 25 in a room, and we would start a conversation. So I'd start a conversation. I had some framework, so it wasn't like it was just open-ended, but we would reason with each other. And I would push people they would say to me, the Bible says, and I say, I know what the Bible says. What do you say? What's in your heart? And I think transformation of people's lives and them feeling included and belonging is about them being known. And some people have some crazy thoughts, and some of those thoughts are very challenging, but it should never be taboo to talk about them. And I think when you've got, you're able to express your heart or express things that you're feeling, places like that are gold. And I think that's what this Reformation we're in at the moment is about. And I think you're going to find an emerging group of people that, we talk about revival back in my day, revival being, the church I was a part of grew from 150 to 5,000 people in 18 months. So that's and then it was churches of 40,000 and so on, in a South African context. I think revival is the wrong word, but that kind of concept of God moving is going to be, we're going to see that again, or we are seeing that again, but it's going to be unseen in the sense of numbers. I think it's just going to be a movement that's happening at grassroots level through family,
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, I was going to, moving back to this idea of mega church and what I think we have lost within these ideas of mega churches. And like Nat says, a mega church can be, different sizes depending on the community that it's serving. But one of the things that I've noticed is a loss of community. There is no community connection. So say like a Joel Osteen church, right? So you have 40,000 people at this church, if that's the correct number. I'm not even sure, and they have these community outreach programs, right? That you as a member of the church, you pay into. And so you get this feeling that you are part of some great program that's helping whoever, but there's no connection to community. You don't actually get to see the fruits of this labor because all you do is you tithe, you give your 10%, you pat yourself on the back, you go home, you watch your football, you do whatever you do. And I think that's the biggest thing that I see coming out of this, the great deconstruction or whatever you want to call it, this Reformation or whatever's happening right now is this idea that to connect to God, I have to connect to my community. And to connect to my community means I need to get my hands dirty and I need to step into the mess of what's going on in my community. And I have to feel like I am actually helping so I can see the work, the God moving.
That's just a contractual perspective, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Put your money in the plate and then you've done your bit, right?
Yeah. And then you get to wash your hands and say, I did my part.
I've got to keep my get into heaven card. What do I need to do? Well, you need to tithe, you need to do the meetings, whatever, which is absolute nonsense.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I noticed too is that, again, I can speak to my experience only, but I think it's fairly ubiquitous across the board, at least in American evangelicalism, is that going back to this transformation thing, what we have done instead, because transformation is so hard to quantify, right? It's difficult to put into an Excel spreadsheet how much someone's transformed their inner life, how much better their relationships are, how are they 10% more patient than they were before. And so we tend to defer to things we can quantify and count. So that to me is the biggest reason why the quote unquote church, and again, I don't even like ascribing that name to them because I don't think it's correct, but I think it's why we've tended to focus on things that are observable, like behavior. So my upbringing, if you'd been raised in the churches that John and I were raised in, you would just swear to God that whatever happens when you come to meet Jesus is all about getting you to behave better. 99% of what we were preached at was all just surface level morality. You can be a terrible person on the inside, but just don't, go to R-rated movies and you'll be okay.
100%. So that's again contractual, because you're basically masking up to belong to the room around you, and you don't belong to yourself then, do you?
Yeah. Well, and they teach us how to mask up everywhere, don't they? I mean, because that's my point. I became really good at putting on a persona that matched the situation I was in. If I was at church, I could be a pious young man, no problem. If I was at school with my friends, I could be, whatever I needed to be to fit into that situation as well. And so rather than come along and tell us that part of what it means to be a Christ follower is to find your authentic self and be that, and because we need your unique expression of God in the world. No. Let's actually put you into this sort of separate Christian mode and make sure, y'all dress right and act right. And
that was, I mean, for me, that's why I wrote this little booklet, it really is, because you cannot do kingdom in a contractual way. It doesn't work. Jesus, it's all a relationship. So if I'm meeting you and I come sit in your home and you've been pretending to be somebody you're not, then I will never know you. But worse than that, you will never feel known. And if you don't feel known, you're always feeling lonely, right? Because you're just not seen. And so that's the surface level. The next step down is, how on earth do you ever have transformation in your life if you're never allowing yourself to be seen? As Paul Young says, the greatest gift we can ever have is exposure. Because when we're exposed, then we have a chance to be transformed. And so if we link it back to Isaiah 61, Jesus came to transform you. You'd ask the question, well, where in this meeting that we're having, or these series of meetings that we're having, do we have any space to transform? If that's the main thing that Jesus came for.
So that takes you back to, Paul saying that, our job is not to be conformed to the patterns of this world, right? To be transformed. And how are we transformed? By renewal. You can't be transformed or renewed if you're busy masquerading as something else.
100%.
There's no opportunity for any transformation, right? If you're not transparent, write this one down, John. Without transparency, there is no transformation. Hey, I might not have been the first one to say that, but it sounds like it works. But that was a big thing for me. And part of my deconstruction process, again, leaning back on that word again, but began with my exit from performance-based religion. Even while I stayed inside of the structure for quite some time afterwards, my heart was long gone from that. Like, okay, I no longer felt compelled to measure up, to perform a certain way, to make sure that people, in fact, it got me in a lot of trouble in the church that I was on staff on, because there were certain things that I was not doing. Actually, I was doing them. I wasn't making a big enough show of those things so that people could see I was doing them. So I got in really big trouble because I wasn't quote unquote, our church didn't preach on tithing, but they did. So I remember getting called into the pastor's office one time and basically being chewed out because I wasn't giving. And how could I hope to be a staff member of that church if I didn't give? And I remember telling him, you don't have any idea if I do or don't, because it's none of your freaking business. And so, but the message being sent was not only do you need to do these things, but you need to make sure people see you doing those things. Yeah, and that's contractual on top of it's performance on top of the contractual, right? Not only are you obliged, but make sure it's seen.
Yeah, so now we have to teach people how to hear God, and we need to teach people how to encounter Him and all those things. I mean, I did supernatural schools all over the world, and I tell you, this is the main thing. We've got a culture that we've created, which is a performance culture, where everybody's masking up and pretending, and now we're trying to connect them with God. It's not just the two don't match. And so once you start to break that down and say, let me see who you really are, then we get a huge fright, and we almost want to tell everybody, can you just put your masks back on so we go back to pretending, it's too bloody hard.
Yeah.
And so what we've labored at is saying, well, look, we've broken our community up into hubs, and we have family, every space is parented, and they're not necessarily parents as in, it's just a term we're using. And not everybody's happy with the term. I understand that not everybody's happy with the term family, but they're just spaces where because behavior is an echo of belief, right? So we try to do behavior modification. It's not going to change anything. If you can change the belief of a person, which is their inner world, then the behavior it'll just take care of itself. So we need to belong before we can believe as well. So we kind of got these steps. We're going, well, you need to belong. So belonging is really important, and you can belong no matter what state you're in. You know, you can be loved no matter what state you're in. That's a true community of Christ, you know. And then you get to decide for your own choice, because now you're in a covenant, a belonging covenant. It's not like, you know, you can only belong if you believe these certain things, and you don't have to have the same opinion as me, like what you had with the tithing thing. You can, I mean, what's that? That's a condition. That's again contractual. So if we have a covenant where we can belong in a covenantal standpoint, then we can get to explore what we believe, and the fruit will be our behavior modification. So we got it the wrong way around, I think.
Well, no, I 100% think we do. Yeah, the cart has been put before the horse almost always. But again, it goes back to that concept that the things that we're interested in seeing and happen in people's lives are difficult sometimes to see. And so I think the easy path, or the easier path, is to fall back on these things that we can observe and quantify and say. I remember talking to a good friend of mine before she passed, but she was 70 or so and had retired, quote unquote. This is a woman who worked harder in her retirement than most people do in their lives, right? But she had retired, and she had taken on a part-time job with she was a Methodist, and so she had taken on a part-time church with her whatever regional part of the Methodist church she was in, where she traveled from these little Methodist churches have small churches all over Texas in particular, probably all over the country. But her job was to travel and sort of gauge the health of these churches. And she was so frustrated because the matrix that they wanted her to use to her were pointless. All they were interested in was membership, attendance, money in the coffers, and that was how they were going to gauge the health of that church. Because, and playing devil's advocate, the rest of that's difficult to see. So on a spreadsheet, I can show you, hey, this church is healthy. They've grown 20% in the last year. Their giving's up this much. They have this many members. They can be a church full of miserable people.
Yeah, they're just business KPIs, right?
Yeah. And so she was going to visit these churches and finding, little communities of, where maybe all their numbers were down, and all of the things that would be indicative of church health on the paper would look terrible. And she'd say, but there was the most amazing little community, and they were doing all of this stuff. And it was difficult for her to convince the powers that be that those churches were in fact successful. And so, yeah, but again, that to me, we keep going back to contractual or transactional. And I think that might be the central issue.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, not many people realize, in Melbourne, Australia, so Melbourne City, Australia, we were through COVID shut down for 2 years. There was no church services for 2 years. So what does that do? What does that do to people, to the tithes? And
that would have been devastating to the church of business, or the business of church.
Which has been, we've celebrated. We thought, thank goodness, God. I mean, this is...
Thank God. Well, yeah, those on the outside going, this might be a good chance for that power structure to shift then, right?
Yeah, because now you're getting back to the real, I mean, why do you go to church? What does that even mean? And I think, to be able to, so people, look, I'm 60 this year. And so I'm kind of like grandpa status and whatever else, in that space. But if you think about a young family, who've got a 4 and a 5-year-old or 10-year-old, there's formation that still needs to take place in those children, right? And so where do they, what's going to form them? I mean, you become the average of the 5 you hang around. That's the truth. So who are you going to mimic? And so I think there's a lot of things we need to think about when it comes to discarding the community completely. I think there's a way of we need to ask ourselves, how do we meet this community? And what is the main things that we focus on? And for us, we've said we need to meet in community groups of 10, 12 people. We do gather every fortnight, but in a larger community, but we're not forcing people to come. We certainly never ask people to give any money. It's really up to them what they give, or if they do or don't give. But the focus is really the smaller groups, because it's transformational times. And those transformational times are not like we are going to have a transformational time now, guys. It's just what happens. It's like, you're gathering and whatever's coming up is coming up. And I think that's really how Jesus, you look at his ministry, that's what he did. It wasn't like, it seems like he walked away from the crowds and he was more intentional with the smaller groups.
Well, and there's something to be said, Soren Kierkegaard famously said the crowd is untruth, right? And so there is this tendency that we have, as Westerners in particular, though, to seek validation in number. Yeah. And so we go, well, look at all those people. They must be doing something right. And a guy like Kierkegaard would say, maybe not. Actually, usually where you see large numbers of people gathered, there's an awful lot of falsehood taking place. The truth is not usually there. It was the crowd that turned so quickly and easily on Jesus and, went from, Hosanna, Hosanna to crucify him because, you can sway a crowd.
I can only speak for the American church, but then the marriage of faith and politics is the other part of it is that if you don't fall in line with the politics of the church, then you're on the outside. And so we no longer have a community of people willing to discuss, have open dialogue about disagreements, because now the church doesn't allow for disagreements. If you are not in line with the conservative, ultra-right, mega church, mega spelled either way, mega or MAGA.
That was a double entendre.
So again, it's another step of losing community, losing the ability to have these disagreements and come to a conclusion that we don't always have to agree on everything, right? Because now we have to agree on 100% or you're out.
Yeah. And so once again, that's a contractual space, I think that's why, we went on a journey. I mean, it's a 10-year journey for me. I'm trying to get some language around this to try and get people into a different headspace. And so if you're going into a covenantal headspace, then, and you're running any group that you're gathering covenantally, and because it's actually foreign to our culture, to our Western culture, the whole understanding of covenant is very foreign. We always have a bad guy. We have a bad guy and we have that triangle, where you have a victim, you have a bad guy, and you have a rescuer. And so we present the gospel like that. The bad guy's the devil, Jesus is the rescuer, and I'm the victim. But if you go to the East, they don't have that perspective at all. It's more of honor. The family is very important. I mean, even in an Indian context where I've worked a lot, they don't have this same thing that we have in the West. And so the West is more around a contractual way of doing life, whereas Eastern thought is more around covenant and family and connection. And so even when you think of God is distant, he's not with us. And so we need to do something to get God to be with us. You think about gospel, the way we presented it, even that's incorrect, Jesus, the whole penal substitution thing is nonsense. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
But it fits with our Western culture. Is what I'm saying. So, someone's got to pay. So Jesus had to pay.
Well, and it fits with the other sort of central lie of religion is that to me that is the lie of separation. And so the idea that that has been promulgated and perpetuated by the church since, maybe it's inception, but soon thereafter, but is that you are separated from God and you need to reconnect. And here's how you do it. Let us be the intermediaries for you, and then the church organization, whatever that is, becomes the conduit by which you now can reconnect to God and then also help you maintain that relationship. Now you need us not just to get in, but also help you to stay in. Baxter Kruger would say that's a lie that we've been telling everyone for 2,000 years. And I've been trying to get people to understand that how was that, ask the hard question. How was that possible? How was your disconnection? How was your separation from God even possible? If you believe that God put everything into existence and breathed it all there and he, maintains it by his very presence, then what happens if he withdraws that presence from any one of us?
Isn't this also a misunderstanding on our part of covenant, right? So I'm pretty sure you've heard this, I've heard this, where I have broken covenant with God, right? But it's the covenant that God has given us that is unbreakable, right?
It is unbreakable, yeah.
But within the Western Church, a lot of times they talk about, they don't use that language. What they're saying is that you've broken covenant with God. And so you've separated yourself from God, or because of your inability to whatever, God has moved away from you. And so that's a lot of, language that we use.
Which is impossible.
Yeah, well, but again, you go back to that penal substitution stuff. You go back to which is all sort of predicated on misreadings of the Gospels, where I heard it preached, and I may have even preached this once, but that if God would turn his back on his own son, what's to stop him from turning his back on you? He wouldn't spare his own son, so you better watch it, And I'm like, but did he? But did he really?
Yeah, I think what we, in simple terms, I mean, in preaching in the villages in India, you have to get pretty simple, and you can't use penal substitution because that's what Hinduism is. The whole pagan festival is very. Then they just basically accept Jesus as another one of their gods. If you give them the whole pagan line, but you think of the Greek word for son is teknon. And then for a child is teknon, and then a son is huios, and then at the age of 30, a son put in place is huiothesia. So these are the Greek words. Bar mitzvah, the whole thing of 13-year-old for the Jew, the little boy, he's not a boy anymore. Now he's a son, and at the age of 30, he's a son put in place. But if you look at the scripture says adopted. It translates that word huiothesia to adopted. So we have this concept where we outside of the family, somehow we got orphaned because God died or something, I'm not sure. And then we have to be adopted back into the family, which is nonsense. That's not even what the scripture teaches, and Paul didn't write that. So adopted is the word huiothesia. So Jesus at the age of 30 was a son put in place. And so basically what happened is that you march your son into the city or into the village square, and you would say, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. And when he speaks, I speak. When you ask him a question and he answers, I'm answering. In other words, you're saying, as he is, so am I. He represents me. And that's what happened to Jesus at the age of 30, and that's what was a Jewish custom. And so even when you think of that, and you think of that adopted principle, and you know that it was never there for the first 1,100 years of the church. You study the church history and the church fathers, there was no such thing as being adopted or being alienated from God at all. It's only in the 12th century you had the scapegoat theory, and then certainly with Calvin in the 1400s and 1500s, you had this, someone had to pay. And so Jesus had to pay a price because we were disconnected. So, the main thing the first 1,100 years of the church was that Jesus defeated death, you see.
Yeah, it's about, this is what I don't know if you know who Brad Jersak is, but we've talked to, you probably do.
No, I know Brad, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the one thing that, we've talked about. When I first met him and first started talking to him, I was just beginning to question atonement theories. And
correct,
so,
yeah.
And one of the conversations that John and I had with him was I said something about Christus Victor, and he's like, well, that's not an atonement theory. That's just the gospel.
That's the gospel, exactly.
It's like atonement theories are just that. They're human, attempts to understand the mechanisms by which this all took place, right? This at-one-ment, which I think is a better way to say it, which is actually grammatically correct.
Yeah, it's not even scriptural, actually.
Oh, no, yeah. And like you said, for the first, 1,000 years, 1,100 years of the church, the predominant theories about how that had nothing to do with punishment. They had everything to do with Christ being victorious completely. And I'm reading through, in fact, I started, when I was pastoring, I started reading John Chrysostom's Paschal homily every year at Easter, because holy mackerel, that's it. You read through that thing and it is full of this sense of complete and utter triumph, and all of this exhortation to, hey, don't despair. If you came to the table first or you are dead last, don't worry. Like Christ has plundered hell. He's taken it over. He's led the captives free. It's just, and it builds on itself. It's a masterful piece of writing. but it builds on itself. And I was contrasting that with Brad. I'm like comparing that to the steady diet we get in the West of, you were a dirty, rotten sinner. Look what you did to Jesus. Look what he had to do for you. Come over here, grovel, scrape. As Luther might have said it, you're now, you're a snow-covered piece of dung. But as Brad would say, but you're still poo. And so there's that whole worm theology. There's so much of it that has to be disrupted. But yeah, that to me was critical.
Yeah, and that's the journey we've been on. I mean, as I say, we've been on. I've been from 40 years of, let's say 35 years of church life, and because it made sin the issue. The issue is sin, you see. But the word hamartia is just falling short. So sin is a fruit of a broken relationship. And when you've restored the relationship, which Jesus is doing, sin becomes a non-issue because covenant covers all of that. If you don't have a relationship, then you have laws. When you've got a relationship, you no longer need the law. Paul writes about it in Galatians 3. So I think it's having a different perspective, and then Jesus can't look at sin. Well, it didn't seem to be a problem to Jesus to walk around as sinner. So you know what I mean. So what's the issue? No, the issue is once you have a relationship. The Hosea Gomer story. It's very intentional. There's a great movie called Redeeming Love, which I don't really like Christian movies. I think most of them are pretty bad. But Redeeming Love is a really good movie. Have you heard about it, Redeeming Love?
No, I haven't. No.
It's a modern-day Hosea Gomer movie. Yeah, very good. Which shows a committed Savior that he's loving he's committed covenantally. You can't break the covenant with God. He absolutely adores you. And all he's doing is loving you, loving you right. It's when you come to understand who you are through your free choice, which is the Dahna, is the fact that we have free choice. So we're choosing in our brokenness or our broken culture. And so God's continually loving us and we get to choose.
Well, because at the end of the day, and that was another, conversation I've had with Brad multiple times is at the end of the day, when you're making those choices that are made out of brokenness or misunderstanding or any number of, or delusion, he would say, well, those aren't really free choices at all.
Correct.
So the idea, that's what I love what he said this years ago when I saw him speak probably the first time. I think he said, I don't believe in free will. I believe in freed will, and so much of our will can be bound up in all kinds of other stuff to say that, well, you had a shot, you had free will and you chose poorly. Oftentimes,
I think that's right. It's giving clarity to that. Eh? So in that movie, Redeeming Love, you see this lady who's loved into her right mind, and you see that portrayed very well in the movie because that's exactly right. I mean, I had a discussion with Paul Young a few months ago about this, and he says, well, it's not really free will, exactly what you've said, but you need to clarify it.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, because that to me is that's the cop-out, right? When you get into a discussion, it's never a discussion. When you get into an argument with somebody who wants to defend their version of evangelical Christianity, it always comes down to, well, God's not rejecting you, you rejected God. You had a free will choice and you chose wrong.
But if you had a broken culture, how could you see?
Well, and the problem with that for me is, so in my free will, I choose to freely say that hell doesn't exist. And I won't go there. That's my free will. And I'm using my free will to say that. And then they're like, well, it doesn't work that way.
My favorite one of that is exactly, I think I said it sort of like that. It was like, okay, if I have total free will, when the day of judgment comes and he says, depart from me, I never knew you. What if I say, nah, I don't think I will. And God somehow, because the other part of that thing is that God won't violate your free will, except when it comes to casting you out. Then he's all well and good with violating your free will. I think there's some truth to that. I think Brad and Paul both would probably agree. Brian Zahn is probably on this same track.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
There is some, and Brad hedges this quite a bit. He's a very hopeful universal reconciliation guy. But inside of his church tradition, he's like, I have to preserve at least an element of human agency here. I can't buy off on something that God just pulls everybody in against their will. I just happen to think that he can persuade everyone.
Yeah, I think I like to look at it like this, and that is that because you just like God, people don't understand. If he's your father, you just like him, right? So because you just like him, how do you have genuine love, connection, or covenant if you don't have free choice? It's not possible. And I think that's really comes down to, now, if you've got a broken culture because of your upbringing, because of whatever, well, then what are you choosing? You have free choice, but you're choosing do you really have free choice?
Well, but even inside of those other models, what you have is a free choice that still has the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. So you're free to choose, but this bad choice will result in really bad stuff. It's love me or else, which is another contractual kind of thing, right? If I had a relationship like that with my spouse, she would no longer be my spouse. She'd have been gone a long damn time ago. Yeah. So that's very manipulative and all kinds of other wrong. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's why it's hard. I mean, to talk about these two things, covenant versus contractual and free choice, it needs a lot of space to really understand what we're really saying, because it's a profound truth, and it needs some time to just percolate, And
yeah, and I would think that any version of that would have to have a lot of margin for us to get it not completely right. You know what I mean?
That's right,
and that was, I get that from, you get that from a guy like Keith Giles, who's like, listen, if our modern evangelical orthodoxy is built upon certainty, then I'm paraphrasing him, but essentially what he would say is that then being right is way more important than anything else. The greatest heresy is being wrong. But I would say in a really loving relationship, there's got to be a wide margin, especially when you're talking about things of God, which we can all act like we know, but we all know we couldn't possibly completely know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say to people, it's not about your sin. And it's not about whether you're right and wrong. It's about journeying into a deeper connection. And so even that is a conversation. But if you think about it, if your pursuit is deeper connection, let's just say you're in your marriage with your wife, your pursuit is deep, you have a massive argument because the reason why you can argue and go completely ballistic at each other is because you know that you're deeply connected. So you can be completely yourself. If you're contractual in any way and you feel there's a threat of separation or a threat of harm, you'll never be yourself. You'll never go there. And so my understanding of this is the marriage union with Jesus, which is with Elohim, it's all of God, is you can go there. You can completely go there because you are covenantally connected.
I think, we said this, I think before, if a God can't handle my anger, then it's not a God that I want to connect with, because there's going to be times where I just don't understand. And my best response is to scream at the heavens because I don't understand why the world is the way it is. God, if I'm worshiping a God that can't handle my anger,
well, then he's a pretty small one.
Yeah, he's a pretty small God.
Exactly right.
Well, I love it, man. I tell you what, you are asking a lot of the same questions that John and I are asking quite a bit. And I know there's a shift happening. The end result of that, I don't know. You know what I mean? I think if COVID showed us anything, and I have talked to several of my pastor friends here in Texas, post-COVID, and they're genuinely shocked that people aren't coming back to church in droves after COVID. I'm like, well, they just went a year in the States. I think we shut down maybe a year. In Texas, we shut down for a few months because we don't give a damn about nothing. But for a good long time, people figured out what they figured out was they could do without it. And that's an indictment of the church. If you went a year without meeting in person and what you walked away from with was, I'm no worse or better off one way or the other, then I'm not sure how much impact that particular church experience was having on you. They found ways to maintain relationships and stay connected other ways. There were people connecting online, people finding themselves in smaller little cell groups that they could, connect with, and found out that a lot of them didn't need the institution of the structural church. And I'm like, that's a lesson for y'all.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there was a pendulum shift. I mean, we had 24% of church communities closed down here in Victoria, so the state of Australia. But I think what's really being addressed there is a contractual way of doing church, or a superstitious way of doing church. My marriage is okay, and my money didn't dry up because I didn't tithe or whatever. But I think that'll be I think the pendulum will come back. I think there's still, for me, there's a need to be in community. It's just, how do you do that? Well, obviously it's going to be different over wherever you live.
Well, it was John Dominic Crossan when he was on the show that said, "Faith without reason is superstition." And so, and I've got that written down because it's one of my favorite things he said. But there's a lot of that I think you're exactly right. People had been, told if you didn't do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, all of these things would happen, whether for good or for bad, right? If you give, you'll be blessed. If you don't give, you'll be cursed. They look up 2 years later and like, actually, I'm still in pretty good shape. So maybe that was just all, corporate baloney.
Yeah, well, you think of the control we have on people when you tell them if they don't do this, they're going to hell, or they could lose their salvation. All these things that manipulate people into doing things contractually.
It's nuts.
It's crazy. Where's us just loving each other and all the things that we read about in the scriptures.
Well, here's hoping that whatever the result of this is, it results at least in something that's more genuine, and something that is, because one of the things that John and I have talked about a bunch is this idea of, obviously we want to have community. I think we're made for it. I think we're built for it. But we want to have authentic community. I don't want to go, I have no desire to set foot in a church building or some other, or even heck, doesn't have to be church. It could be any other situation you might put yourself in where you feel like you have to be a certain way to be there. That's why I don't hang out, at super rich guy parties. I wouldn't fit in there. I don't want to have to go put on airs to be there. Well, I do think we tend to gravitate towards people who are inclined to see us for who we are and still like us or want to be around us. So that's what I'm looking for. Whatever happens as far as that goes, I'd like to see that result in some more genuine, more authentic expressions of community. And if that has to take place, in my living room, so be it.
I think what you're expressing is the heart cry of God. Because you can't have the Isaiah 61 experience if you're not yourself.
Right, exactly.
It's not possible. And actually, so what is the journey of salvation? We talk about a prayer. It's not a prayer. The journey of salvation is a transformation of your inner world. And how can you have a transformation of your inner world if you're never allowing yourself to be exposed or fully seen? Because you're pretending to belong somewhere. It's just not possible. So what Jesus is doing in the world today is bringing it back to what it's just a forgotten way. It's not a new thing. We think we're doing a new thing. We're not doing a new thing. We're just doing a forgotten thing.
I like that. And that's what it feels like we're going back to, is hope. Again, some will be drag kicking and screaming into these new ways. Some of us will be cheering from the sidelines going, yeah.
I think it's interesting. 3% of Australians go to church, right, regularly. So that's 790,000 people because we're a small population, 26 million. When I immigrated here 30 years ago, it was 9%. But yet more than 55% of the Australian population say they're Christians. So where do they go? Well, they go to sporting events and things.
Yeah, they've clearly they've at least drawn the conclusion that they can follow Christ without necessarily aligning themselves with an organization or a structure. And maybe they can't. I don't know. I think the jury's out on that. But man, I appreciate all of your good words and your wisdom. And so have enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did too.
No, I did, mate. I think it's thanks for having me on. It's a
Absolutely.
real privilege to be able to talk to you guys.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch. where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.